The lymphatic system. Are you enthusiastic? Are you excited? The lymphatic system. We are going to revisit briefly some of the components of the blood. We glossed over them initially, but it is important to understand those to understand normal operation of the lymphatic system. These slides, at least in their current form, are on Moodle. You can follow along. I'm sure they will be adapted and updated, and again, I'll post the new updated slides when we're done this section. So specifically, in the context of blood, we are going to explore some of the roles of white blood cells. We've talked at length about red blood cells. They contain hemoglobin, they carry oxygen, big component of the blood, major component in understanding gas exchange and delivery to the tissue. But white blood cells often go not unnoticed, but somewhat glossed over. These are the cells that are important in mediating the immune response. The immune response is largely mediated by those cells, and those cells tend to be produced and reside mostly in the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is the system dealing with, not exclusively, but largely dealing with invading pathogens, fighting invading pathogens, producing cells that are involved in fighting invading pathogens. It has secondary effects as well that we've seen already when we talked about absorption in the digestive system. The lymphatic system is also the site of fat absorption from food in the intestines. We will, after outlining the major components, look at immunity. So immunity is our ability to successfully fight off invading pathogens. And we have a number of systems in place to do that. That number is 2. And there are subpoints to each of those: innate and adaptive immunity. And we will look at, on the adaptive side, how we fight those pathogens. What do we gain? What does our body learn to do to fight those invading pathogens properly? Which is a really important topic, I think, considering some of the misinformation about antibodies and vaccines and the public at large these days. So we'll look at this system in a fair bit of detail. Let's recall quickly a slide from ages ago. Functions and properties of the blood. We saw the blood, which is largely, or the body, which is largely fluid, the blood, which is half plasma and formed elements, being any cells in the blood. And we focus mostly on red blood cells, as they are the majority of those formed elements. But platelets and white blood cells are also obvious and present. They make up part of the buffy coat that separates those 2 layers. And white blood cells are really what we want to focus on in this section. You can see the breakdown of them on the right-hand side. Neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils. Luckily, we're not talking about those too often, and basophils. So white blood cells are leukocytes. Collectively, they're also referred to as leukocytes. The names are the same. White blood cells, leukocytes. And these are the cells that are involved in defense against invading pathogens. We will probably spend most of our time on lymphocytes, the infantry soldiers of the immune response. The cells of the lymphatic system, lymphocytes in the lymphatic system. Those are going to be paramount, very important, but we'll make mention of all of the white blood cells, at least in passing. And you've seen, I believe, if I remember correctly, you've already looked at things like neutrophils and some of these in lab already. So white blood cells. White blood cells, easily differentiated from other formed elements in the blood. They tend to not have a nucleus, they don't have hemoglobin, and they are either classified as granular or not granular. And granular is attributed to the appearance of vesicles inside of the cells. When you stain them, the vesicles appear as individual units, almost small cells within a larger cell. that contain various enzymes and proteins that are used to degrade incoming pathogens. So white blood cells as a whole can be grouped into two main groupings, granular or agranular. Agranular simply means there are no internal vesicles. There are no little beads after staining when you look under a microscope. And you'll notice lymphocytes are agranular, one of the few along with monocytes. But neutrophils, eosinophils, I'm not sure how, eosinophils, the second one, and basophils, granular. So granular and agranular, you see the difference presented here. The white blood cells are the large central cells in each figure. The granular nature shown in the ones on the left. Agranular, there are still components inside the cells, but not a number of small individual vesicles. And some noteworthy cells, neutrophils and monocytes. Monocytes end up becoming macrophages, which you might have heard about before. That's not too important, but that's where macrophages come from. They're differentiated monocytes. Those two types of cells destroy bacteria and other invading pathogens through phagocytosis, which is a process that you've seen before. Engulfing, ingesting, and breaking down the pathogen. And one of the enzymes of choice that neutrophils use is lysozyme, which is an enzyme that we referenced briefly in the digestive system. It's an enzyme that's abundant in saliva that helps to start breaking down incoming particles as they enter the digestive system. Also helps protect against invading bacteria at the mouth. So lysozyme, one of those broad spectrum bacterial breakdown or defensive mechanisms. It's really quite interesting how all of this works, and this is a broad high-level overview. There's even proteins that are little spears, and they poke holes in the walls of the bacteria, and they burst. We have cells that make little tiny protein spears that burst bacteria physically. It's pretty cool. The lymphocytes are the main soldiers in the lymphatic system, in the immune response, and they differentiate into three major types of immune cells that we'll reference a fair bit throughout this section: B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells, or NK cells. I'll introduce these coming up. They have a broad variety of activities. They target slightly different tissues, but their jobs are to promote things for degradation that should be promoted for degradation, to target specific invading pathogens and have them broken down or break them down themselves. So B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells are differentiated lymphocytes. And if you're curious, there is a big family tree of all of these cells in chapter 19 of the book. It's more detailed than I care to go into, but you can see how they're all arranged if you so choose. So, white blood cells. White blood cells are always around. They're always present in some amount. They can live for years, in contrast to red blood cells that only last weeks to months and are degraded. They combat invading microbes and are induced in response to infection. So we start to produce many more white blood cells in response to infection. And often, if required, you can obtain what's called a diff count, a white blood cell differentiation count, to see what kind of white blood cells are apparent in what amounts, to get a sense of what kind of invading microbe your immune system might be dealing with. Something a pathologist might No, pathologist isn't the right word. I forget the name right now. Endocrinologist? That might be right. What an endocrinologist would look at to see what the nature of the invading pathogen is. So increased white blood cell count, also known as leukocytosis, the expansion of white blood cells, happens normally. It even happens in response to something like exercise. Exercise can affect the immune system and potentially, depending on the intensity, can depress the immune system. The opposite to a high white blood cell count is low white blood cell count, or leukopenia, which often accompanies severe treatment like chemotherapy, radiation therapy, or severe shock or stress. But overall, the total white blood cell count can give you an indication of what kind of invading pathogens are present in the body. Now, how present are they? Let's put it into perspective. So we know red blood cells. As a fraction of blood, they're about 45% of blood. The hematocrit's 45%. They outnumber white blood cells about 700 to 1. So an increased white blood cell count, it goes up, it's large, it still pales in comparison to the amount of red blood cells in the blood, just to provide a little bit of context. Now, even though this is the lymphatic system section, white blood cells circulate freely in the blood. White blood cells. The lymphatic system houses and produces primarily lymphocytes, but other white blood cells. And from there, those cells enter the blood and travel throughout the vasculature. And they can be induced to target and move to sites of infection from the blood. It's a process called emigration. White blood cells can emigrate or leave the blood in response to an infection or an invasion, so they are in the immediate presence of whatever the invading factor is. And they have to in order to destroy it. They need to be able to do this and be localized to the site of infection. They do that by, let's take a look at this neutrophil moving through the blood. And the surface of the neutrophil has some integrins or adhesion molecules on the surface. Molecules that will stick if the right counterpart is found. And the counterpart you see here expressed in the walls of the blood vessel. The endothelial cells, these little springs, are selectins that trap, like Velcro, neutrophils as they move through the blood. Now, they don't always have the little springs, have the selectins evident to trap neutrophils. When there's an infection, there are signals in the local environment that make these epithelial cells, or not epithelial, endothelial cells, produce these proteins that will trap neutrophils as they move by. And the purpose of that is to say, there's an infection happening here, happening close by. I need to grab you out of the blood because I'm going to transmit you or move you across the vascular wall into the area where there's an infection so you can do your job fighting that infection. So only where there's an infection do these selectins get expressed, which means only where there's an infection do neutrophils and other white blood cells emigrate from the blood. Very targeted approach to finding the site of injury and instituting an appropriate response. Now, the majority of white blood cells will do this. They will be targeted to a site of infection. They will differentiate. They will consume bacteria themselves. They'll also be consumed, and they don't return to the blood. This is a terminal fate for a lot of the white blood cells that emigrate from the blood. 4 of the 5 types of white blood cells leave, and don't return after being triggered as part of an immune response. So all of the granular leukocytes and monocytes that differentiate into macrophages, they leave the blood, don't return. They don't return to the lymphatic system. It's terminal. Lymphocytes, on the other hand, will leave the blood, will fight infection, will differentiate, will produce antibodies, and all of these mechanisms we're talking about in this section coming up. And after leaving the blood and doing their job of fighting infection, they return to the lymphatic system. From the blood to the interstitial fluid to the lymphatic system, and then circulate back through the lymphatic system to the blood again. They're completely recirculated. So lymphocytes, evident in all compartments, very versatile, can return to the blood and be reused again. Now 98% of the lymphocytes that you'll find are in the lymphatic system, in the lymph, in the fluid, in the lymph nodes, in the ducts. 2% are in the blood circulating. So only a very small proportion of lymphocytes will be in the blood to emigrate and return to the lymphatic system. But they are recycled. Now lymphocytes. Let's just introduce the different kinds of lymphocytes briefly, a bit more detail on them, and then we might wrap it up because we've covered a fair bit today. So lymphocytes, like all white blood cells, are induced by infection. They respond to invaders. They have many roles in recognizing the specific invader, in targeting other cells to engulf and destroy that invader, in producing antibodies that label the invader. Lymphocytes, very important in the immune response. And even though I'm going to show you 3 categories of lymphocytes, within each category there are helper cells, there are killer cells, there are a bunch of different types of cells. So they ramp up with infection. They can be reduced if the infection persists or with therapy like immunosuppression and HIV. The first kind of lymphocyte is the B cell, which is oddly enough named for where it's produced in birds. When it was first characterized, it was produced from the bursa of Fabricius in birds. And it's not produced in a bursa in humans, but it was named for the location where it's produced. In humans, it's produced in the red bone marrow. So you could think of bone for B cells or blood for B cells. They're produced in the red bone marrow. And they specifically will attack bacteria, toxins, and they secrete antibodies within whatever compartment they're in to help target things for breakdown. So B cells doesn't stand for anything. Blood cells or red bone marrow cells from where they're produced. T cells, another type of differentiated lymphocyte, will attack infected cells of the body. So not invading bacteria or pathogens that are separate from the body, but if a cell of the body has been infected, if it's been invaded, if it's been co-opted by a virus, T cells will attack and try to rectify that situation. So they are primarily responsible for the immune response to tumors, or when transplants reject the tissue, T cells will recognize that it's not my normal innate body tissue and attack the cells thinking it's a foreign invader. T cells are so named because they are produced in the thymus. And we will talk about the thymus when we outline the major flow and organs of the lymphatic system, but this one, the T stands for where it's produced, in the thymus. And lastly, natural killer cells. They are generally, they're the general specialists. They can attack tumor cells, they can attack bacteria, they can attack infected body cells, a wide variety of infected cells. So they are the jack of all trades cells in the body. And these are very loose, general distinctions within each group. Again, there are multiple types of B cells, types of T cells, etc. We'll talk about the major types as we go through. But I simply wanted to break down this hierarchy for you. So lymphocytes, a kind of white blood cell, a kind of leukocyte. And they differentiate into these three main types of immune cells that will fight invading pathogens. And we will reference these often in our discussion. So, important to have your head wrapped around that. Any questions? This makes for a natural break point.